Great. Okay, so thank you everyone for kind of taking the time this evening, logging in and joining us for this workshop. This is on the Bergamot Area Plan Objective Design Standards Project. Before we get started, just some housekeeping items on how to participate tonight. I think everyone's kind of familiar with how to unmute, and you've got your cameras on, so we probably don't have to go through that exercise. But there are some there's a raise hand function that you can use at the top if you want to be able to speak. We'll have some opportunities at the end of the presentation, so we'll have some Q&A and we can open it up for discussion. So you can use the chat button. You can also drop questions or comments throughout the presentation in the chat, and we'll go ahead and make sure we can kind of go back to your question if you want to do it that way. And also we can use the chat button for any technical issues that you might be having during the presentation. And we do have staff here available to provide some assistance on that front. So with that, let me go ahead and fire up the presentation for this evening. Okay, so for tonight's workshop, we're going to be providing an overview of the Bergamot Area Plan project. And for those who are joining us for the first time, and then also providing a recap summary of the project for those who had joined us on previous workshops last year and have also been following along to the Architectural Review Board as well as the Planning Commission study sessions. We'll be going over existing examples of objective design standards in Santa Monica, what we are looking to achieve in this project, which is essentially making changes to the Bergamot Area Plan standards to support housing projects. And we'll also get into staff's conceptual approach in simplifying the BAP standards. We'll also provide a recap on the initial set of design standards that we've developed last year. And perhaps maybe, Carrie, if you can drop the link to those draft standards in the chat, then people can either click that and you can kind of follow along with what we have thus far. It's not the end product by any means. It's really just an initial set that we've been working on through kind of like some public outreach later in last year. We'll also go through project timelines moving forward from this point. And again, as I mentioned, we'll be able to have some open discussions later on after the presentation. And we want to get your comments on in terms of like how best to shape our residential buildings within this particular area. And so really quickly, so our housing element was certified back on October 14th, 2022. And also in March of last year, the City Council adopted citywide zoning changes, including feasible housing development standards in our commercial districts that encourage greater housing development in order for us, the city, to meet our state RENA requirements. And also, whereas the height and FARs in the Bergamot area were also increased for housing projects as well. And so this next phase includes revising the BAP standards in accordance with our housing element program, which is program 1E. A quick refresher, just the heights and the FARs as mentioned for housing projects that have already been adopted for the Bergamot Area Plan are shown on this table. And so to be clear, we are not making any changes to heights or FARs with this project, but rather we'll be developing design standards based on these new FAR and height allowances. So a quick reminder of what is a objective design standard. And so objective standards are requirements that are measurable. They are verifiable with no personal or subjective opinions. An example of this is a guideline might state to plant appropriate trees along the street, whereas an objective design standard would require a specific number of trees and perhaps maybe how far apart they are required to be planted. So that's kind of an example between, and then on the screen, you can kind of see the differences between what is a guideline and then, of course, what is a development standard. The terms development standards and design standards are somewhat interchangeable, but they do have different characteristics and meanings. Development standards typically inform the general massing of a structure, and this is your heights, your building heights, and your building floor area ratio standards. It's basically your building envelope. While design standards are more detailed standards that influence the design of a structure. So these could be your building modulation standards, any transparency requirements on the ground floor, open space design, and also facade treatments in terms of materials. So as many of you are probably familiar with working in Santa Monica, the city zoning ordinance already includes a number of objective design standards that help essentially shape the design of our buildings. For example, we have standards in our commercial zoning district citywide that help to create ground floor design that is interesting, that is active, as well as engaging to pedestrians at the street level. Open space standards that provide both private and common usable open space for residents living in a building. We have upper story and interior side setbacks that reduce overall building massing on upper floors. In the downtown community plan, we have a standard called an unbroken facade length standard, which ensures that building facades along the boulevards include some changes in planes, and that's really to provide visual interest, and that's so we can tackle the long building elevations and we don't end up with a flat wall. We have daylight plane standards that seek to provide upper level stepbacks for buildings adjacent to residential neighborhoods. And this is to help ease that transition between our commercial and our residential neighborhoods. And so the concept of objective design standards are not new to Santa Monica. And this ODS project seeks to both formalize design recommendations that are commonly provided through our architectural review board, and to also consider objective design standards to address the anticipated future growth of housing projects in the Bergamot area plan districts. And this is all in coordination with our housing element. So let's get into the program itself, the purpose and the scope of the project. But before getting into it, it's important to know like how we got here. And so the Bergamot Area Plan, it was adopted back in 2013, and it really envisioned creating a neighborhood that both conserves the existing industrial character and also the arts community while taking advantage of the nearby light rail station by removing any barriers to housing and local services to efforts to create a livable community. Now, however, since its adoption, there have been 0 projects built under the current BAP rules and development standards. And so for these reasons, City Council had directed the city to incentivize housing production in the Bergamot area as part of our housing element processes. And this essentially resulted in the increase in both heights and FARs for housing projects in the area. And then also the need for us in this next phase to develop objective standards to help shape and design these projects. And so Housing Element Program 1E, as I mentioned, includes simplifying the BAP standards that are supportive of housing projects. In terms of background, the Bergamot Area Plan is characterized by larger parcels, and we're predominantly with commercial uses with very limited residential uses and services. The area has large city blocks with limited cut-through connections between blocks. And of course, we are in proximity to the light rail station, which really speaks to why residential is key for this particular area. Those who are familiar with the current Bergamot Area Plan, you'll recognize these diagrams on this slide that illustrate the required building modulation for upper floors. Feedback from the community is that these existing standards are generally complex and too restrictive. And so we've really looked at the downtown DCP standards in both its simplicity, but also in its effectiveness. And so the revised BAP standards will be similar to the downtown community plan standards. This will help provide consistency in both the downtown area as well as the Bergamot area that now do have comparable residential development potential. So we're looking at probably similar size buildings in the future. And so we're looking to kind of coordinate standards for both of these areas in the city. We will be evaluating project or potential standards for taller buildings, which for some standards may provide options to provide achieve the standards and maybe perhaps different options as part of kind of a toolkit of objective design standards. We'll also look into incentivizing space for artists, which is consistent with the Bergamot area plan goals and policies. And essentially the goal here is for us to encourage developers to design according to the standards that we would establish, especially for density bonus residential projects, meaning that the standards that we create are not major impediments in developing the project itself. Here is another current diagram for open space configurations in the BAP. So we'll be looking to eliminate prescriptive standards to how common space would be configured on a site, and instead focus on ensuring that the common areas will actually be used by residents with design amenities, the layout, and what kind of goes into a good common open space. Later in this presentation, we'll be discussing the concept of ground floor pathways through larger projects that would provide connections for resident mobility kind of throughout these future neighborhoods. We do need to update our parking standards sections in the BAP to reflect new state law, which no longer requires parking within the area. And this is based on the Bergamot area plan's proximity to transit. And we'll also be updating parking design. We'll be looking at bike parking standards and looking to really kind of make them consistent with the rest of the city as we incorporate all these standards back into the zoning ordinance. It'll allow for a lot of ease of review and applicability. And so the Bergamot area plan also includes what are called street-based frontage standards. And this is for each of 6 different street types established in the plan. These street types might focus on pedestrian orientation. There's a street that focuses on carrying vehicular traffic. There's one called a shared street, which is intended for accommodating bike parking and vehicles. And I believe there's one other for one that focuses really on landscaping design on Olympic Boulevard. Now, very quickly, the genesis of this concept of the street frontage standards back in 2013 is really based on projects being subject to development agreements in the city, where new streets to improve these connections throughout the districts would be realized through DA negotiations. And so, however, now that the city has really moved away from development agreements and housing projects are now streamlined and they are now based on objective standards, having these street-based standards no longer really has meaning in terms of implementation if we're not able to execute them. So we are now kind of left with these standards, which include multiple requirements embedded in them, depending on the street type, that has shown to be overly restrictive for developers. And so we'll be looking to eliminate these prescriptive standards, instead simplify ground floor requirements to perhaps a single set of ground floor design standards that would be a little bit more consistent with what we have for the rest of the city. Okay, so at the end of last year, we held workshops and a few study sessions with the Architectural Review Board. as well as the Planning Commission. And again, as mentioned, we developed a set of initial draft standards that we'll be using as a jumping off point at this point in time. We'll be looking to refine these initial standards. We'll continue to simplify our existing BAP standards while also developing new standards as appropriate and just making sure that they won't become barriers for housing development. And so the bottom timeline here highlights our next steps for this project. We're starting from picking up back starting to today, and we're going to go through the end of September. And you can kind of see that we have a few more technical working group workshops coming up, as well as a few study sessions before we start to get down to Planning Commission recommendations and eventually City Council adoption of these standards. And so moving on to the next section, Stephanie is going to go through a recap of these conceptual standards that we've developed so far and go into a few questions for the groups about design. So I'll hand it off to Stephanie.
Thanks, Steve. That was really helpful. I also want to encourage folks as I'm presenting, if you wouldn't mind to type your thoughts and questions in the chat, and if I can't address them during the presentation, then we'll have plenty of time for Q&A afterwards. Next slide, please. So, starting with last summer, we worked with the ARB subcommittee, that's 3 members of the 7-member board, to review conceptual standards. We'll be, after this meeting, we'll be doing a technical working group and starting up those meetings again with our ARB subcommittee. We had a session similar to this one where we received general community feedback at the end of October. We had a study session with the full board, and they expressed support of the overall approach of building modulations, of pedestrian pathways, and then the Planning Commission study session where they were focused on any number of things, including safety design standards for those pedestrian pathways, and we'll explain a little bit more what those might be. Ground floor transparency percentage, not to be overly restrictive. We currently have transparency requirements in the code, so we'll be reviewing those again. And then roof line variation standards to be flexible. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Operable windows, pedestrian pathways, and ground floor transparency. Next. And so there are a few different categories that we've been working with for the conceptual design standards. As Steve mentioned, we're using some of the standards that were developed fairly recently in the Downtown Community Plan. We've had several projects that have been entitled under the Downtown Community Plan, and we found that the standards that have been incorporated into that plan seem to work as a good baseline for good design. And so we'll want to include additional standards that start to shape the building envelope, but we don't want them to be complicated or restrictive. We want to make sure that they enable sufficient visual interest and three-dimensionality without being really prescriptive or, we don't want standards that would make all buildings look alike. So there needs to be some level of flexibility, simplicity and flexibility so that we get lots of beautiful varied buildings. And so as Steve started to mention, the different categories that we're focused on, as we mentioned, activating the ground floor, which has always been very important to the city of Santa Monica, and that's why we have such a walkable city. Open space for common open space design. Some, might be at the edges that the public gets to enjoy, but also open space for the residents of any particular housing project. Open space that might be through these large parcels. As Steve was mentioning, and as you all know, because you're all really familiar with the Bergamot existing conditions, that is an area that was focused on industrial production, and therefore the parcels are larger, the building footprints are larger, and that results in fewer pedestrian connections, making it a little bit less walkable. The streets are a little bit more narrow, sidewalks are a little bit more narrow, not as many street trees in the as in the other areas of the city. And then, as the standards have changed, the zoning standards have changed to allow taller buildings. We will look at some design standards to address that. Next. So, in activating the ground floor, there are a lot of tried and true principles. One of the things that is relatively new came in with the housing element is the allowance for residential units to be on the ground floor in any street. Previously, there were active use design standards that would prevent predominantly residential units on the ground floor of our boulevards. But now we can have residential on all the ground floors. And so we will need to make sure that there's a balance of privacy for the residents, but also a sense of openness and interest at the street. So, one of the principles is to have entrances to the residential units or to the building, to a multi-family building at the street rather than, on the side street or elsewhere. And that uh, any ground floor commercial will have a sufficient depth so that that commercial can thrive, and that there would be substantial amount of transparency. More would be required for commercial uses because that's really good for commercial uses, and about 20% seems like a sweet spot for the residential units. So all throughout this relatively brief presentation, we'd like you to think of these questions and, really in the question and answer, try to give us some of your thoughts on these. One of the things that as we transition from this light industrial area that is the Bergamot area to a more residential neighborhood, there are certain amenities, certain sensibility that make a residential neighborhood more livable. And so if you can think about what are the changes and the amenities that would be really helpful to make a beautiful residential neighborhood. Where should ground floor commercial be required? Ground floor commercial, as you know, since pandemic, has really contracted in every city, including Santa Monica. So we couldn't possibly require ground floor commercial on every street, even the existing streets that are in Bergamot that are existing. But how much should we focus on? Because there will need to be some neighborhood commercial uses. And then what are some of the elements that enable the ground floor to interact with the street in a way that makes it really interesting for pedestrians to stroll along the street? Next. Another area of focus is common open space design. One of the really special things about Santa Monica is, we have great air quality. We have lots of, fabulous parks, not to mention the open space of the beach. And in our neighborhoods, it's the green and the open space that really provides relief for the urban environment of Santa Monica. And so, what are the common open space? Now, these would be spaces that might largely be privately occupied by the tenants within buildings. And so, what are some of the principles that make for really good common open space? That most of it, or at least some of it, is open to the sky. So what we're starting to work with is an 80% open, maybe 20% covered with, buildings that cantilever over the open space. Or, for example, in the picture on the lower right, there's an open walkway that's opening on to the open space that may be considered part of that open space. Landscaping and trees that are necessary to soften the open space and make it really feel livable. One of the things we really focus on is having our open spaces within projects create a social space so that a building community can form. The city of Santa Monica has a really wonderful history of courtyard apartments that have historically provided this kind of social space that starts to provide a core of community and belonging. And so with the open space for each project, we want to make sure that the open space is not simply places that you pass through, but places that you can sit and gather with your neighbors or your friends. And then how much seating would be necessary to make for a comfortable space. There are probably more amenities and standards that you could think of, so we'd really like your thoughts on what really makes a livable open space. Next. Now, creating connections through in order to create additional open space in the Bergamot area plan. As we mentioned, the size of the parcels are really large in the Bergamot area plan, and that makes the neighborhood less walkable. With strategic cut-throughs through some of these larger parcels, which will likely be needed for fire lane and services, these pedestrian pathways will add some walkability, will add porosity and a sense of openness to the neighborhood, and as I said, walkability. So here are some images that demonstrate what those might look like. And so, what are things when you walk around in Santa Monica or in other cities? What are features that really help you really make you want to walk around the neighborhood? Where should these pedestrian connections be located in Bergamot? If you can think of incentives, because having a pedestrian pathway go through a project is space that a private owner would give up. What incentives can the city provide to encourage these walkthroughs or pass-throughs, and what amenities would be in these spaces? So here we see seating, landscaping. There are many types of amenities that could be provided, artwork, areas for, open market stalls, etc. Next. And so when we talk about building design, some of the words terms we use are modulation and articulation. This essentially means a three-dimensional change in the building that provides some visual interest and three-dimensionality. So what we don't necessarily want to see is a building that's designed to the full zoning envelope as a rectangular, as a simple rectangular box. Sure, buildings will be rectangular, but in order to have some interest, there needs to be, as we say, some change in plane throughout the building. On the upper right-hand corner is a image that comes from the downtown community plan, which identified a certain percentage of space that needed to be set back in the building 5 feet in the downtown community plan. On the building sides, there's also necessary indentations, if you will, to modulate the buildings. The other thing that our decision makers, designers, architects have always been interested in is how to enliven the top of a building, which will become more and more important as the buildings get taller, so that we create that when you look up to the sky, you'll be creating some visual interest, and also as you go up, you'll be able to see more of the sky. And the buildings don't seem quite so big and blocky with the right modulation standards. And so these are some of the things that we're considering. We'll start with the downtown community plan standards for, as we call it, modulation uh, as a point of departure, roofline modulation, to have a sense of interest at the roofline, and we want that to be flexible so that we get a variety of different design solutions. And something that we call the daylight plane on the lower right-hand side, which enables a building that might be across the alley or adjacent in a different zone that's a much lower building to get a little relief, because you'll have the building step back away from that lower building. And so, questions for you to think about. And again, these are for us to answer, but your feedback is really valuable to us. That do the conceptual standards that we're showing in idea and also in photographs. Would these make it interesting for you to walk around and look at the buildings, and should additional standards? So as I mentioned, we'll maybe start with the downtown community plan standards, and what kind of special standards or other standards would be necessary for the larger parcel sizes and taller buildings. Next slide, please. And so here's some examples of modulation. On the upper right, you have a building that was fairly recently developed, 501 Broadway, Koenig Eisenberg Architects. On the lower right-hand side is a building at Lincoln and Colorado by Michael Filonis Architects. The other two images, I believe, are not in the city, and you can see how these these buildings are varied in their three-dimensionality, and each one is completely different from the next, and provide a sensibility of visual interest and three-dimensionality. Next slide. So at this point, we want to get your thoughts on our point of departure, and the concepts that we're presenting to you. I know it's a lot of information. So the areas for discussion are, as we mentioned, activating the ground floor for pedestrian orientation, What kinds of things would you foresee in the Bergamot area that might be unique to the Bergamot area, but also transition that to a residential neighborhood? Where should ground floor commercial be required? Is there a natural center, a natural place where you think that kind of activity might gravitate towards? And what are the different ways that you've experienced ground floor residential design to interact with the street? For common open space, the standards that we're starting to work with requiring certain amount of amenities and landscape and open to the sky. Are those a good start? Are there others that you can think of? Um, Modulation and interior side step backs. This is sort of a three-dimensional puzzle that I think some folks on the call are really familiar with the entitlements that have resulted from the downtown community plan uh, guidelines and standards. Since not a lot of those projects are built, maybe not everyone understands how successful they are. And then what are your thoughts on modifying and modulating, creating interest on the upper floors? The daylight plane, is that something that for those developers and architects on the call, would that be implementable? Is there another version that might accomplish the same thing that's easier to work with? And then these creating connections for open space and the ground floor pathways. This will be a standard that's really unique to the Bergamot area, and figuring out where those go and how we incentivize them for development teams and the development community. Having your input on that would be, exceptionally important to us. So I've talked for, I think, a long time, and I'm going to pause and ask you all to please see if you can think for a few moments, and you can use the raise your hand function or just unmute yourself. I can see you and help us with your knowledge of the Bergamot area.
Will there be a park, just like a park in this plan?
So that's a really good question. We don't have other than the space that the Bergamot Art Center, which will not be a park. We don't have city-owned property within the Bergamot area plan that's slated for a park. Ishihara Park is fairly nearby, but our intent is to provide to have some street frontage requirements that enable additional green space in the space of the street, and these additional pathways through projects to enable that to be green space and open space that the community will enjoy. That's a great question. Thank you.
I'll just keep talking. Like in
Yes, please. Yeah.
in Playa Vista, which this reminds me of all this planning, they do have a few parks that you can kind of promenade around, walk and, feel the air, bring your kids. So that's what I'm thinking. Doesn't
Yes.
sound like there
Yeah.
will be that many.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that Playa Vista is, as you know, is a much larger territory and underwent more than one master planning effort before the master plan that was adopted and required those parks and the form that you see realized now. That was a unique development because it was a specific plan that where essentially nothing else or almost nothing else had previously been built. Because these properties are all privately owned, there will likely not be opportunity for a city-owned park.
Hi, this is Kara. I have some questions about the pass-through ideas. I understand it's for large parcels that you want people to be able to walk through, probably similarly to like the water garden area. Um, I guess some challenges or you know, issues I see with that, and maybe we can just talk through some of them, is um, how big of parcel would you have to have before that's required? Can you have a subterranean garage underneath these pass-throughs? I think based on the presentation, you cannot have any building over these pass-throughs. So, which would mean your your project above ground, if you can have parking below it, would definitely need to be multiple buildings, which is multiple means of egress, and with the high-rise requirements, that's a lot more costly for the pressurization of the stairs. So yeah, just trying to wrap my head around that part of it.
Those are all really great questions. Steve, would you be able to pull up the plan, the overall diagram of the Bergamot area, so we can look at the parcel sizes? Maybe. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's fine.
maybe this is good. So um, as you can see on in uh, the northwest area, those parcels are a little bit smaller. I don't think we're looking at those parcels. I think there might be some parcels that are, I mean, I don't I don't actually recall the number we were working with. Was it 80,000 square feet? But the pretty substantially sized parcels that would likely require fire access through them in any case. So if Kara and others on the call are familiar with the Millennium Development, that's got a couple of pass-throughs all the way through, and those are required for fire access in any case. We haven't particularly broached the question of below grade parking underneath those pass-throughs, but I don't see why that wouldn't be allowed. Um, and you had a couple of other questions in there to unpack, and I'm not sure I remember them all.
No problem. My other questions were, do the pass-throughs, are they intended to be open to the sky? In which case you would have like basically separate buildings, two, maybe
Right.
three, I don't know.
Yeah, that is the idea, to have smaller footprints for buildings, which is in fact a current requirement in the code. There's a maximum floor plate size, I believe, of 30,000 square feet. Um, I'm sorry, I don't have all of this quite memorized yet. But that already exists in the code. That would be incorporated. Some similar standard would likely be incorporated into the Bergamot area plans, so that the build there for a very large parcel, there may be a collection of separate buildings. To your question of would those be required to be open to the sky? That's a really good question. You know, it's quite possible that cantilever over the sidewalks on either side, or some cantilever, but we anticipate that the majority of that would be open to the sky. Great questions. George.
Thank you. Yeah, I think mine is kind of in a similar vein. It's the draft conceptual standards that were circulated indicate that, you know, it could be required for smaller parcels as well. You know, looking at a 0 to 40,000 square feet parcel, for instance, that would be really challenging for us to do.
Right.
Just the way that we're looking at the building right now, to cut the site, you know, basically in half and have an open pathway in the middle of it would create a challenge with feasibility of the project. And so my question is kind of similar, you know, what is that minimum size? And I think, you know, understanding that would be really critical as far as, you know, understanding what we can do. But I do think that, you know, it makes sense for the larger parcels where you have these multiple building projects. If you're on 80,000 feet and you're going to max out the floor plates, you're probably going to have 3 buildings on that site. So they're going to be separated anyway. And, you know, having a way to get through on a large, you know, half of or full block parcel would make sense. But I think getting clarity on that would be good.
Yeah, I guess my question to you is in looking at the draft standards. So for, you know, I see what you're saying. For 80,000 square feet or greater, we would want 12% to be those circulation paths. 40,000 to 79,000 square feet, 10%, and less than 40,000 square feet, 8% area. So what I'm hearing you say is that if you had a parcel that was 40,000 square feet or lower, any requirement for a pass-through, mind you that when that would likely not be required to be open to the public, and there would likely not be a requirement for pathways for those, but that there would be some open space in those areas. So that's the requirement for so the minimum. So just to clarify, if the parcel size that we're looking at, and I'm sorry, I'm not sharing my screen, but it's on, for those of you who have it open, it's on page 11 at the top. It's titled ground floor pathways, but the table that's shown is a minimum area of open space. So that could be a courtyard, it could be any type of open space, and not necessarily a pathway through the building. So that's what that table is showing. And for the ground floor pathways, you know, we've taken an initial look at this with our consultants, AECOM, and we've started to think of, you know, the 80,000 square feet or greater parcels might have the cut through.
Got it. That's helpful. Yeah, I think, you know, the challenge is really trying to figure out how to a passageway through a 40,000 square foot parcel and still.
No, we wouldn't require that. No, we wouldn't require that.
Yeah, it doesn't
you know,
make sense.
Yeah, the idea is to make it easier, not harder.
Sure. That's great to know. And then, I mean, in response to some of the questions, I think that, you know, the question that you posed about requiring commercial space is actually a really good question. I'm happy that you're asking that. So from the financing side of things, when we're talking to our partners, they come and they look at the retail and other new buildings that have been built, and they see so much vacancy. And they, they basically kind of ding your project if you have retail in it, because it's really challenging to say, well, we're going to lease it at, X amount per square foot, when they go and they look at the Catherine or they look at the park and they see all this vacant space. I mean, there's countless examples that I can give. So I think that it is actually really great that the city is allowing for there to be 100%, residential on ground floors, because that it makes it so much easier just to have that conversation. I don't know that it would be beneficial to require commercial space. I think that a developer that is trying to maximize value could see a need for commercial space if there was one, but a requirement, if there's not a need, is going to make it really challenging to get a project financed. And so
That's interesting.
in this particular area, we're looking at a project here, and we actually would love to do some kind of retail, but at the moment are unsure whether it would be financially viable to put retail in our project. And so
Right.
we're not quite there yet.
Yeah.
As far as making that decision, but there's not really a critical mass of population in that area. With the office vacancy as high as it is during the daytime, it's tough to say, well, we'll put in a new cafe or restaurant and have that make sense and have a tenant come, walking, ready to open at this time. But I think as more projects get built there, people will want to add retail as an amenity to their project. We certainly see a cafe or a restaurant as an amenity to our project, but we just don't know that we would have the enough business for a restaurant to open at this time.
Yeah, I guess I have a couple of responses to that and questions. Well, first of all, full disclosure, I was at SciArc when it was at 3030 Nebraska, and I would have really loved to be able to eat something other than a tuna melt at Young's. But be that as it may, I think what we are hoping that you can help us with, if we do have a place, let's say it's 2 blocks. It's hard to talk about blocks, but say a length of, say, 500, 1,000 feet of commercial space required. I think Kathy, who unfortunately has left us for the meeting, she mentioned Playa Vista, that there's, a couple of different village centers that were identified in that master plan. If we did identify a commercial center, where, for those of you who really have a great sense of the Bergamot area, where might that be best located?
Well, I love where it is right now. I mean, you kind of have that where the art galleries are. You've got Bertie G's over there. I think that's phenomenal, and I think there's more vacant space there, and some of that space, will fill up as there's more of a population there. You've got vacant space at Water Garden that's retail space, and a lot at Millennium as well. So I think that
Right.
there's a lot of vacant retail space there. It's just a matter of getting the volume of people in that area to support those retail establishments. But I agree with you, and I think what's the other the Daisy? What is it? Not the Lazy Daisy. Forget the name of that little place.
Yeah, Lazy Daisy.
Lazy Daisy, right? That place is great. So
Yeah.
you have some little spots there. I think that eventually that little part on I think between Olympic and Nebraska, that large 4 parcel development. I mean, I know it's traded recently, but that would be a really great place for some retail as well. I think that's
Yeah, that seems to us like a natural center it's kind of a geographical center of the neighborhood, and it feels like a natural center. Yeah. That's
But I
that's
do
an
like that,
interesting
Erica.
observation.
And I think that, I think the Bergamot, I agree, it's one of the best places to develop in Santa Monica. It's quiet. You don't have as much of the tourist traffic from downtown. You just don't have as much of the traffic as you have in downtown. It seems like it's a little bit, as it is quieter, it feels a little safer. It's kind of got a unique industrial characteristic about it right now. And I think that, as a developer, we would, and we're kind of envisioning keeping some of that characteristic in, the new project, because it's got a really cool kind of element to it. And I think, the arts, all of the art galleries over there are really great. I think doing more of that is a really great idea. And I also would like to ask, how is the incentive, like, what is the incentive to keep art galleries there, or to focus on artist residences? Is there an actual incentive that the city is providing to create artist residences? And this is even a further question, but is it allowed for us to have residences specifically for artists, or doesn't that violate like a fair housing law of some sort? Because I think that's a really great idea.
I mean, artist lofts have been historically required. LA has done them. It's certainly easier to do in a development agreement, in a by right, or in a zoning code. It's hard to require, but potential to incentivize. And they are considered commercial uses. Um, the other thing that's really interesting is that, um, having residences in a project or in an area is really, it's a really attractive feature to, folks like us architects, planners, and the decision makers. But often, what is found is that the spaces that are identified as artist lofts or live work lofts, which, as I said, are commercial uses, often those are not, they're not at a price point that artists can really inhabit. There's also an effort that the AIA has undertaken to work with the building codes so that they're easier to build, because there are a lot of challenges between the separations that are required between residential uses, as you know, residential uses and commercial uses, because the artist lofts or work live units are considered commercial.
Right.
Those are really good questions.
I mean, I think that, to your point, artists can't really afford to pay, many artists, and there's some obviously that can, but I have a ton of friends that are artists, and that a lot of them are just, they're getting by, but it's commission to commission, it's, piece to piece. And I think that, it would be interesting to see a way to do like affordable housing and have some of your affordable component be specifically for artists, because there is, that is a big piece of how we're building. We have these big affordable components, and if you could say, hey, a third of these are reserved for artists because this is an art preservation area, an art incentive area, I think that would be a great thing to do. But
that's interesting. It's something that we can consider. Certainly something we can consider within the bounds, legal bounds, and also within the housing element requirements. I think Christina has a question. Hi, Christina.
Hey, I was wondering similarly about the non-residential, residential transparencies. Is the way that the draft written now supposed to reflect residential ground floor usage? So for example, if it's a walk-up unit, we're all familiar with like walk-up units and brownstone units in New York. They have lower level units, yes, most of the
Right.
time, but the upper level units are actually set above 18 inches. And that creates a sense of, you know, privacy for those ground floor units, but still create some connection to the street as opposed to a flat blank facade. So I'm wondering, maybe I'm just not reading this correctly, but I wonder if that 18 inches is restrictive for maybe those kinds of ground floor units. And then in addition to that, you know, another thing that could be looser is allowing some of that 50%. And I agree, I think 50% transparency is really prescriptive for ground floor, especially if it's supposed to be commercial, but allowing maybe some of that to be live work units, right? Where the ground floor unit is, you know, a workspace for a lofted living area.
Right. One of the things that we've also heard from our architects and developers, especially when we have the image of the steps and stoops up to the residential units, is that that creates an ADA or an accessibility challenge. For architecture. So we need to balance the planning requirements with those requirements of the building code. You know, we certainly want to enable a stoop or steps up to to the unit, but also not require them so that we're creating an accessibility challenge. And you know, certainly we can look at the heights. So for commercial, you know, this is something we've discussed, the 18 inches for commercial uses. The 18 inches really helps to bring it closer to the street. It's something that we can certainly look at for residential, is to enable that to be a little bit higher off the street. Excuse me. The challenge that we have is that we wouldn't necessarily want there to be, say, if the ground or the ground floor level was at 5 feet, let's say, above the sidewalk level, and you didn't have you know, kind of semi-subterranean unit, then you would be walking against a blank wall. I think the walk-ups that we're thinking about in Brooklyn and Manhattan and other places very often have semi-subterranean units that have some level of windows and activity and gardens at the ground level that interface with the pedestrian. I'm not sure that we would see that. That is a really, it's a European and an East Coast model that I haven't really seen here in Southern California.
Okay, and the other question I had was about parking. So a lot of these projects will have structured parking, um, even for the multifamily. Is there kind of a section that addresses urban design standards for garages?
Yes, we will. We've started to work on that to make certain that any above grade parking is implemented with a kind of design and materials that are integrated into the rest of the building. Because with the new development standards, we do anticipate that we will see some above grade structured parking, and we want to be prepared for that with the design standards. These are great questions. Okay, Ozzy, we haven't heard from you. Jason, Parham, we haven't heard your thoughts yet. Sorry to call you out. And you can sit with the document for a while and let us know afterwards. I think you know how to reach us. So maybe while we're we're waiting for others to have some thoughts that you could raise your hand or so forth. Steve, I think maybe it's a good time to talk about next steps.
Sure, yeah, let me bring up the PowerPoint. Okay, so as we kind of mentioned, our next two stops are going to be continuing on with our kind of our community outreach with a more technical working group. These are meetings are going to get a little bit more technical and deeper into the standards themselves, and so perhaps
We can't
we
see
can.
your screen, Steve,
Oh,
if
I'm
you think you're
sorry.
sharing.
Yeah, hold on. Okay. So yeah, as I was kind of mentioning, our technical working groups, these are going to be a little bit more technical with the standards themselves. I think we're going to start to run through more detailed concepts, a little bit more tighter than we've talked about today. And so our next stop is for March 21st. We're also then looking for a second one on April 18th. So we'll go ahead and send out the invite citywide probably next week for the 21st. And so in the past, we've assembled technical working groups during our housing element phase. And so what our outreach is really just trying to find, architects and designers, affordable housing providers, developers. These meetings are still available to anybody in the public, but just in terms of the scope of what we'll be looking at is more detailed of these draft standards to try to get some language together. And after that, we've got some study sessions that we'll be taking to the Architectural Review Board. We have a stop at the Planning Commission. So you can kind of see the progression as we work towards eventually getting to council in September. And again,
Yeah,
here's
and
kind of that timeline, just to really close it up real quick here, but we'll have all of this information posted on our city's website after the meeting. So you'll be able to kind of go back to at least even just seeing this PowerPoint deck, that'll be a part of it. And then of course, these calendars here. But go ahead, Stephanie.
yeah, I was just going to make sure everyone knows that, all of these meetings are open to the public. We welcome your participation. Our Architectural Review Board, Planning Commission, City Council, as most of you know, are in-person meetings. Technical working group will likely be virtual, and they also may be during the day for folks that are, professionals and do this all day long, developers, affordable housing providers, and architects. So we have a really great, really knowledgeable group on the call today. We'd really like you to tell your friends, encourage your colleagues to come to those meetings and share their thoughts. Particularly, well, all of you, Santa Monica residents or not, folks who develop here, folks who just like to walk around. So we're so grateful that you spent part of your valuable, really beautiful evening with us, and I'd like to call on you to see if there are additional comments you'd like to share this evening, or if you'll join us for our next workshop and share your thoughts then.
I'll just say thank you.
Well, thank you for coming. This has been great. It's a little bit of a quiet group. I'm used to a little bit more of a raucous participation, but hopefully next time when you're more familiar. Cynthia, do you have something?
No, just joining in. I didn't have I only have a few minutes, so sorry to miss the beginning.
Well, thank you for joining. Okay, so I guess going once, twice. Thank you all so much for participating. This is recorded, so we'll be able to go back and listen to your questions and comments so that we can keep those in top of mind as we develop the plan.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.